Imagine a time when the world was convinced a mysterious, glowing substance was a miracle cure. It made watches gleam in the dark, and it promised a bright, modern future. Now, imagine a young woman, proud of her job, looking down at her dress at the end of a long day and seeing it sparkle with a beautiful, ghostly green light. She didn't know it then, but that lovely sparkle was a kiss of death. This is the tragic, infuriating, and unforgettable true story of the Radium Girls, the women who painted the dials, swallowed the poison, and fought for justice against a corporation that knew the truth and watched them die. Listen closely, because their fight changed the world. The year was 1917, and America was buzzing. World War I was raging in Europe, and here at home, the demand for military equipment was soaring. That's where the young women of Orange, New Jersey, came in. They worked for the United States Radium Corporation, or USRC, painting luminous dials for soldiers' watches and aircraft gauges. It was a good job, modern and important, especially for women of that time. The substance they used was called Undark, a clever mix of radium and zinc sulfide. Radium itself was a new wonder material. Discovered by Marie Curie, it glowed on its own, a magical, eerie blue-green light. People thought it could cure everything from arthritis to impotence. It was expensive, fashionable, and considered completely safe, or so the workers were told. The painting studio was clean and well lit, unlike the dark factories most men worked in. It was a space for women, filled with the soft chatter of girls in their late teens and early 20s. For many, it was the best job they'd ever had. They were part of the war effort, earning about $1 a day, 3 times what other factory jobs paid. The job itself was delicate. They had to use tiny camel hair brushes to paint incredibly fine lines and numbers onto small watch faces. The company foreman had a very specific instruction for them: lip, dip, and paint. The tip of the brush would quickly lose its shape. To get the fine point back, the girls were instructed to put the brush between their lips, draw it to a point, dip it in the glowing paint, and then apply it to the dial. It seemed innocent. The paint had a slightly sweet taste. The foreman and even the owners of the company assured them that the radium was harmless. In fact, some of the women were encouraged to use the paint to play little tricks. They painted their fingernails, their teeth, and even dusted the glowing powder into their hair on their way to dances. Imagine the effect: a luminous smile in the dark theater. They literally glowed. They were the envy of their neighborhoods, the ghost girls who brought the magic of radium home on their skin and clothing every day. They had no idea they were painting their own death warrants. They were young, they were proud, and they were breathing, tasting, and swallowing a deadly poison with every passing hour. The job was tedious, but the atmosphere was light. Girls like Grace Fryer, a shy, determined teenager, and her friends, Quinta MacDonald and Catherine Schaub, would spend hours huddled over the dials. They were paid by the piece, so speed was essential. The lip dip paint method wasn't just encouraged. It was the quickest way to keep the brushes fine, and therefore, the quickest way to make more money. No one wore protective gear. Why would they? Radium was the good stuff. It was sold in health tonics and cosmetics. The girls became quite careless with the radioactive dust. The paint would spill, and the fine powder would settle on their clothes, their work tables, and the floor. They would dust it off their aprons and even use it to lighten their complexion, believing the rumors that radium was beneficial for the skin. Some even kept the unused paint in small containers to apply to their lips for a striking, glowing lipstick before going out. But while the women were licking their brushes, a very different standard was being applied to the men working in the USRC factory. The highly paid chemists, physicists, and managers who handled the raw, unprocessed radium wore thick, lead aprons and used tongs and masks. They understood, on some level, the danger of working with the raw, concentrated element. They knew the risks of inhaling or ingesting the dust. The USRC actively misled the painters. When one of the women, nervous about the reports of radium's potential dangers, asked the company doctor about it, he simply laughed. "It's perfectly safe," he assured her. "Why? I wouldn't hesitate to take a dose of it myself." They painted a picture of a beneficial, health-giving substance, contrasting sharply with the elaborate precautions taken by the male scientists who worked just meters away in the processing rooms. The women were disposable labor. The men were valuable scientific assets. The daily routine was one of cheerful, unknowing self-poisoning. The girls would share lunch in the workroom, their sandwiches occasionally dusted with the glowing powder. They went home smelling faintly of the chemicals, often with the ghostly green residue still on their faces and hands. The money was good, the work was fun, and they were surrounded by friends. No one had any reason to suspect that the very thing that made their job so magical, that faint, intoxicating glow, was slowly, relentlessly, destroying their bodies from the inside out. The radium they ingested wasn't passing through them. It was settling down in their bones, mimicking calcium, and radiating them from the skeleton outward. The first signs that something was wrong weren't dramatic. They were subtle and easily dismissed. The earliest workers, those who had been painting for a few years, started to complain of persistent, nagging dental problems. Toothaches that wouldn't go away, gums that bled constantly, and teeth that seemed to simply fall out without much reason. A woman named Amelia Molly Maggia, one of the most dedicated and cheerful painters, began to suffer terribly. She was forced to quit her job when a toothache turned into an abscess. When her dentist tried to pull the tooth, the wound wouldn't heal. Instead, the pain intensified, and her jawbone started to decay and disintegrate. Molly went from doctor to doctor, but none of them could figure out what was causing the strange, aggressive deterioration of her jaw. They tried to remove the dead bone, but the rot kept spreading. The bone was literally falling apart, piece by piece. Molly was in constant, agonizing pain. Doctors finally had to remove her entire lower jaw in a gruesome operation. In September 1922, Molly Maggia, barely 24 years old, died. The death certificate listed the cause as syphilis, a common and socially damning diagnosis used at the time for any mysterious, fast-acting bone disease. This incorrect, shameful diagnosis was a devastating blow to her family and a convenient cover-up for the USRC, who were already aware of the potential for radium poisoning. Molly wasn't the only one. Other girls who had started around the same time began to experience similar horrific symptoms. Constant, crippling joint pain that doctors wrongly diagnosed as rheumatism or arthritis. Anemia, extreme fatigue, and bone fractures from simple falls. Their bodies were failing them in bizarre and unpredictable ways. Back at the factory, the company was starting to get nervous. They knew that radium's half-life was 1,600 years. Once it was in the body, it wasn't going anywhere. Yet, when the first sick workers asked about the paint, the company flatly denied any connection. They had too much to lose. The war effort, the lucrative contracts, the reputation of their miracle product, it all hinged on keeping the dangerous secret. The girls, meanwhile, were facing a disease no doctor understood, a silent, invisible killer that glowed under a simple black light, revealing the poison they had so innocently ingested. The fight had started, though the women didn't yet know they were fighting for their lives, not just their health. As the number of sick girls grew, the local doctors were utterly baffled. They had never seen anything like it. These were young, previously healthy women, yet their bones were disintegrating. They suffered from radium jaw, a condition that looked exactly like the terrible industrial disease known as phossy jaw, which had afflicted workers in match factories decades earlier, but without the phosphorus. The doctors were stumped and often quick to resort to those misleading, shameful diagnoses like syphilis, or simply dismiss the women's pain as hysteria, a common fate for women complaining of mysterious illnesses at the time. The USRC was watching this unfold and actively working behind the scenes to control the narrative. They hired their own medical experts, not to help the women, but to confirm their own official stance, that radium was safe, and the illness must be due to poor hygiene, pre-existing conditions, or totally unrelated causes. They paid off one doctor, a prominent physician, to publish a paper claiming that the girl's illness was caused by something entirely different, completely disregarding the fact that the only thing all the victims had in common was their work at the radium plant. But a few honest medical professionals began to look closer. They started to wonder why the workers in the plant who didn't paint the dials, the men who handled the raw or weren't getting sick in the same way, while the painters, who ingested the poison directly through their mouths, were dropping like flies. One doctor in particular, a dentist, grew suspicious when he noticed that every time he operated on one of these former USRC employees, the surgical wounds failed to clot or heal. The women's blood chemistry was completely disrupted. Another independent expert, Dr. Cecil Drinker from Harvard, was hired by the USRC to conduct a confidential study on the plant's conditions. Drinker's findings were damning. He found significant levels of radiation contamination throughout the entire factory and concluded that the workers were being poisoned. However, when he submitted his report, the USRC simply paid him for his services, edited his report to remove the most incriminating conclusions, and distributed only the heavily censored, sanitized version to the public, claiming it proved the factory was safe. The original, devastating truth remained locked away, and the girls continued to suffer and die without understanding why. They were fighting an invisible disease and a very visible corporate cover-up. Grace Fryer started working at USRC when she was just 18. She was one of the first and most enthusiastic painters, relying on the job to help support her family. Like the others, she loved the glow and the camaraderie. But by the mid-1920s, Grace was suffering from crippling dental issues and severe pain in her foot. The pain became so intense that she needed crutches to walk. Her teeth were falling out, and the pain shot up through her jaw. After watching her friends, including Molly Maggia, die in agony, Grace knew in her heart that her illness was caused by the radium paint. It was the only thing that made sense. But the company wouldn't budge. They offered her a paltry sum to cover some medical bills on the condition that she sign a waiver releasing them from any future liability. Grace, supported by her determined father, refused. She was seeking justice, not charity. She wanted the truth exposed. This decision marked the start of a grueling 5-year battle. Finding a lawyer willing to take on the powerful USRC was nearly impossible. The company was wealthy, well-connected, and experts in delaying tactics. They stonewalled every inquiry, paid off witnesses, and used the censored Drinker report to prove their innocence. Grace and her family went from attorney to attorney, but no one wanted the case. It was deemed too complicated, too technical, and too politically dangerous. Finally, in 1927, they found Raymond Barry, a young, ambitious lawyer in Newark who was willing to take a chance. Grace was no longer fighting alone. She was joined by 4 other women who were also rapidly deteriorating: Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. These 5 women, the Radium Girls, were all visibly sick, some barely able to walk. Their bodies were wasting away, but their resolve was steel. They decided to sue the USRC for damages, effectively launching a war against the biggest secret in American industry. They faced a race against time, as the radium poisoning meant they literally had only months, maybe a year or 2, to live. As the legal battle began, scientific clarity finally emerged thanks to an independent physicist named Dr. Harrison Martland. Martland was a brilliant researcher who finally cracked the mystery of the Radium Girls disease. He was the first to use a device called an electroscope to measure the exact amount of radiation remaining in the women's breath. Martland asked the sick women to breathe into a specially designed apparatus. What he found was astonishing and terrifying. Every single exhaled breath contained radon gas, a gaseous decay product of radium. This meant one thing: radium was not just on their clothes, it was inside their bodies, specifically embedded in their skeletal structure. The girls had been swallowing the radioactive substance, and their bodies, mistaking it for calcium, had deposited it into their bones. Once there, the radium continuously emitted alpha particles, which act like tiny, powerful bullets, blasting the surrounding bone marrow and tissue, causing cancer, bone necrosis, and ultimately, death. Martland also conducted autopsies on some of the women who had already died. He found high concentrations of radium in their bones, which, years later, were still radioactive. He also noticed something heartbreakingly poetic and tragic. When placed in a dark room, the corpses of the women actually emitted a faint, ghostly glow. The radium they had ingested was literally illuminating their bodies. The glow in the dark was no longer a party trick. It was the indisputable evidence of murder. Dr. Martland's findings completely undercut the USRC's claims. He provided irrefutable scientific proof that the girls were dying from chronic, internal radium poisoning. The disease was not syphilis or poor hygiene. It was an industrial catastrophe. This breakthrough gave Grace Fryer and her fellow plaintiffs the scientific ammunition they desperately needed for their lawsuit. However, the USRC still managed to use their wealth and influence to drag the legal proceedings out, knowing that time was on their side. The women's lives were measured not in years, but in the slow, inevitable ticking of radioactive decay. The Radium Girls lawsuit was front-page news across America, but the sensationalism came at a cost. The USRC's legal strategy was simple and cruel: delay, delay, delay. They requested postponements, claimed procedural errors, and tied up the case in bureaucratic knots. They knew that the victims' bodies were doing their deadly work for them. Every delay meant another month closer to the women's inevitable demise, and a dead plaintiff couldn't testify. By 1928, Grace Fryer and her four co-plaintiffs, Edna, Catherine, Quinta, and Albina, were in truly dire straits. They were frail and often too weak to attend court proceedings. Their lawyer, Raymond Barry, saw the desperate urgency. His clients were suffering agonizing pain, and they needed justice and medical compensation immediately, not years down the line. It was a clear, brutal race against time, a legal battle where the radioactive clock was ticking down to zero. The women were also battling public perception. While many were sympathetic, the USRC employed high-powered public relations teams to muddy the waters. They suggested that the women were exaggerating their symptoms for financial gain, or that the illnesses were due to their own recklessness. It was a vicious smear campaign designed to preserve the company's stock value and reputation. Despite the pain, the women were determined to appear in court as often as possible. They wanted the jury and the world to see the cost of the company's lies. Grace Fryer, in particular, became the face of the tragedy. Her courage in the face of suffering was undeniable. She embodied the injustice that had been inflicted upon hundreds of working women. The press labeled their fight the most dramatic legal battle of the decade. But for the girls, it was a daily struggle simply to live long enough to see justice served. They faced their mortality head-on, fighting for the truth even as the poison ate away at their bones. The case of the Radium Girls finally gained critical momentum thanks to the relentless efforts of the media, particularly a muckraking journalist named Walter Lippmann, and later, a powerful feature by the New York World. These articles didn't just report the facts. They painted a vivid, emotional picture of the young women's suffering and the cold indifference of the powerful corporation. The journalists focused on the shocking discrepancy. The women, who were paid little, were slowly dying, while the company executives, who knew the dangers and took precautions themselves, were completely healthy and wealthy. Public outrage surged. People couldn't ignore the image of these young women, whose lives were being sacrificed for a glowing timepiece. The company realized that continuing the legal battle in the face of such negative publicity would be disastrous for their future. The USRC stock was starting to suffer, and their reputation, crucial for securing government contracts, was in ruins. Faced with a devastating public relations nightmare and overwhelming scientific evidence from Dr. Martland, the USRC finally capitulated. The settlement negotiations took place swiftly in June 1928. The terms were read out while the women were present, many of them propped up on stretchers or in wheelchairs, barely able to speak. The final settlement was a mix of compensation and promise. Each of the 5 women received a lump sum payment of $10,000, a substantial amount for the time, equivalent to over $180,000 today, plus a guaranteed annuity of $600 per year for the rest of their short lives. Crucially, the USRC also agreed to pay all of their ongoing medical and legal expenses. For the first time in years, the women had the financial means to seek the best possible care, though they all knew there was no cure. The USRC did not admit fault or liability, but the settlement was a clear victory. It was an acknowledgement of their suffering and a small measure of justice won against impossible odds. The settlement in 1928 provided closure for Grace Fryer and her co-plaintiffs, but it did not end the story of radium poisoning. In fact, the radium industry was not finished. A second group of women, working at a different plant in Ottawa, Illinois, for a company called Radium Dial Company, a competitor of USRC, were just beginning to suffer the same terrible symptoms. This new group, led by a fiercely determined woman named Catherine Wolfe Donahue, faced an even tougher fight. The Radium Dial Company executives learned from the USRC's mistakes. They were even more aggressive in their denial and cover-up. They systematically destroyed records, threatened workers, and insisted their paint was safe, claiming the illnesses were due to tuberculosis or other unrelated causes. Catherine and her friends, like Inez Vallat and Charlotte Purcell, started to sicken in the early 1930s. They, too, had been instructed to point their brushes with their lips. The company's cruelty was immense. One victim was even given an X-ray by a company doctor who, seeing the clear damage, lied to her face, saying she had a clean bill of health. The key difference in the Illinois case was the legal context. Because of the previous fight in New Jersey, Illinois now had stronger workers' compensation laws. Catherine Donahue and her lawyer, Leonard Grossman, decided to pursue the claim through the Workers' Compensation Board, a much slower and often less effective route than a direct lawsuit, but one that protected them from the endless legal delays that had nearly killed the New Jersey girls. This second wave of Radium Girls had to prove, once again, the undeniable link between the glowing paint and their dying bodies. The sacrifices of the New Jersey Five had paved the way, but the industry's greed ensured that the tragic cycle continued, forcing a new group of brave women to fight the same terrible battle. The fight waged by Catherine Wolfe Donahue and the Illinois Radium Girls became a landmark workers' rights case. Catherine, whose own health was rapidly failing from bone cancer caused by the ingested radium, was the core of the defense. Her resolve was particularly remarkable because the company, Radium Dial, and its powerful legal team fought tooth and nail, challenging every piece of evidence and attempting to discredit the women. The company's defense was based on the premise that no one had proven exactly when or how much radium the women had ingested. They tried to claim that the decay of radium in the body was a natural process, not an injury, and therefore not covered by workers' compensation. It was a sophisticated, highly technical, and deeply cynical argument aimed solely at preventing the company from being held financially responsible. Catherine Donahue had a tireless ally in her young, dedicated lawyer, Leonard Grossman. Grossman knew they had to rely on the overwhelming medical evidence. He brought in Dr. Martland and other experts who testified about the radon gas in the women's breath and the high levels of radioactivity in their skeletal systems. However, the Workers' Compensation Board was a slow-moving, bureaucratic body, and the process took years. Catherine, like Grace Fryer before her, was forced into a painful race against her own body's decay. The proceedings were often held at Catherine's bedside, as she became too weak to travel. Imagine a courtroom moving to a dying woman's bedroom. This scene captured the imagination of the nation and put immense pressure on the judges. Catherine's dignity and resolve, even as her body failed her, were powerful silent witnesses against the corporation's greed. She was determined that her life and the lives of her friends would not be lost in vain. She wanted the courts to acknowledge the truth. They were poisoned at their workplace by a product the company knew was dangerous. The Illinois case, Donahue versus Radium Dial Company, dragged on throughout the 1930s. The company appealed every negative ruling, taking the case all the way up through the state courts. Meanwhile, Catherine Wolfe Donahue's condition worsened dramatically. She developed a massive tumor on her leg, and the constant pain was unbearable. She had sacrificed every remaining ounce of her strength and time to the legal fight. Finally, in 1938, the Illinois Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling. They sided decisively with Catherine Donahue and her fellow workers. The court found that the Radium Dial Company was responsible for the women's illnesses and deaths. This victory was monumental. It established a critical precedent in American labor law, that an employer could be held liable for an industrial disease, even if the symptoms didn't appear until years after the exposure. It recognized the concept of a long-term occupational illness, a huge step forward for worker safety. Sadly, Catherine Donahue didn't get to enjoy the full measure of her victory. She died less than a month after the Supreme Court's decision was handed down. She had held on just long enough to see justice served. Her lawyer, Leonard Grossman, later said she died with her boots on, still fighting the case until the very end. The impact of her sacrifice was immediate. Following the Supreme Court ruling, the remaining Illinois women quickly received compensation. The case also served as a stark, final warning to the radium industry. The scientific and legal reality of radium poisoning was now impossible to deny. The U.S. government also took notice. The story of the Radium Girls and the findings of Dr. Martland about internal radiation were instrumental in shaping new safety standards for industries handling radioactive materials. The stories of the New Jersey and Illinois Radium Girls finally forced systemic changes across America's industrial landscape. Their suffering created a new understanding that invisible dangers, like radiation, chemical fumes, and fine dust, needed strict regulation. The practice of lip dipping was immediately banned, and factory safety standards were drastically altered. For the first time, companies were required to provide proper protective gear, gloves, masks, and lead aprons to workers handling dangerous materials, even those previously deemed safe. Scientific bodies were established to measure and regulate workplace exposure to toxins. The women's sacrifice led directly to the formation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, decades later, and fundamentally shaped the enforcement of industrial safety standards that protect millions of workers today. The legal precedents set by Grace Fryer and Catherine Donahue were perhaps the most significant legacy. Their lawsuits made it possible for workers to sue companies for negligence regarding workplace health hazards. Before the Radium Girls, it was incredibly difficult for an employee to prove an occupational illness. After their cases, the burden of proof shifted slightly, making companies more accountable for the long-term health of their staff. The USRC and Radium Dial eventually went out of business or moved far away from public scrutiny. But the ghosts of the Radium Girls remained. Their story became a cautionary tale of corporate malfeasance and the devastating consequences of putting profit over people. They went from being women who innocently painted dials to becoming pioneers of occupational health, sacrificing their lives to win a moral and legal battle for future generations of workers. The eerie, beautiful glow of radium was finally exposed for what it was, a horrifying sign of internal destruction. Even decades after the last lawsuits and the closure of the factories, the physical traces of the Radium Girls' work remained. The factory sites in Orange, New Jersey, and Ottawa, Illinois, were found to be dangerously contaminated. Radium, with its 1,600-year half-life, doesn't disappear easily. The remnants of the paint, dust, and contaminated waste were scattered across the grounds, and in some cases, the radium was even found in the soil and water near the former plants. Cleaning up these sites became a long and incredibly expensive endeavor for the government. Buildings had to be dismantled and tons of radioactive soil removed and disposed of in safe, designated areas. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, eventually got involved, confirming the severity of the contamination. This lingering presence served as a constant, physical reminder of the deadly legacy left by the U.S. Radium Corporation and the Radium Dial Company. But perhaps the most profound lingering presence was the effect on the bodies of the women themselves. Dr. Martland's research showed that the bones of the victims remained radioactive long after their deaths. In the 1950s and 1960s, scientists, driven by the need to understand the long-term effects of radiation, exhumed the bodies of several Radium Girls, with the permission of their families. They wanted to study how radium decayed and affected the human skeleton over decades. These studies confirmed that even 40 years after the women had stopped working, their bones still held significant levels of radium. The analysis of these remains became crucial data for understanding radiation dosage and risk, influencing safety protocols not just in factories, but in the burgeoning nuclear industry and for medical applications of radiation. The women who glowed in the dark continued to serve science long after they were gone, their very skeletons telling a powerful, silent story of sacrifice. The tragedy of the Radium Girls ultimately became a massive, unintended scientific experiment that changed how the world viewed radiation. Before their illnesses, radium was seen as mostly external, dangerous only if handled carelessly in large doses. The girls' suffering proved that tiny amounts, when ingested, could be far more lethal than anyone imagined because the body concentrates the poison directly into the bone marrow. This discovery was incredibly important during the Cold War era, when the use of nuclear materials expanded rapidly. The data collected by Dr. Martland and subsequent researchers who studied the Radium Girls' bones established the foundational understanding of alpha radiation's danger when internalized. Alpha particles, though blocked easily by skin or clothing, are catastrophic when released inside the body. The women's experience also led to the establishment of the acceptable limits for exposure to radioactive materials, known as maximum permissible doses (MPD). Their unfortunate experience provided the baseline for safety standards used globally by organizations today, including the International Atomic Energy Agency. Moreover, their case highlighted the importance of industrial epidemiology, the study of disease patterns in specific workforces. Their deaths prove that a cluster of unusual illnesses in a factory must be investigated seriously as a potential occupational hazard, overriding the corporation's insistence that the disease was the fault of the individual worker. The Radium Girls' tragic fate forced the scientific and medical communities to take the connection between work and illness seriously, saving countless lives in subsequent industries, from mining to manufacturing. The story of the Radium Girls is a narrative built on individual names and immense courage. It's important to remember not just the scientific and legal outcomes, but the women themselves. Grace Fryer, the determined teenager who refused the bribe; Catherine Schaub, who fought despite her crippling joint pain; Quinta MacDonald, who stood by her friends through the grueling legal fight; and, of course, Catherine Wolfe Donahue, who literally died in the battle for justice. These women were not scientists, lawyers, or political activists. They were working-class girls who took a job to earn a living and help their families. They loved to dance, they loved to dress up, and they believed in the patriotic importance of their work. They were victims of the era's naive enthusiasm for a new technology and of a corporation's cruel disregard for human life. Their legacy is not just the regulations they inspired, but the powerful reminder of the vulnerability of the worker and the absolute necessity of corporate transparency and accountability. They showed the world that when powerful interests hide the truth, ordinary people, even those considered disposable labor, have the power to organize, fight back, and demand justice. Today, when you see a safety sign in a factory, when you read about worker protection laws, or when you learn about the safe handling of chemicals, remember the names of the Radium Girls. They were the brave women who paid the ultimate price, and whose sacrifice lit the way for the safety of generations to come, casting a permanent light on the dark corners of industrial greed. The story of the Radium Girls is hard to forget. They took a job that promised a better life, and they paid for it with their bones, their youth, and their lives. They taught us that a beautiful glow can hide a deadly truth, and that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't on the battlefield, but in a small courtroom, fought by women too weak to stand. They didn't just win a lawsuit. They sparked a revolution in worker safety that protects you, me, and everyone who steps into a workplace today. It's a story of corporate betrayal, scientific breakthrough, and the enduring power of ordinary people fighting for what's right. What part of the Radium Girls story, the corporate cover-up, the scientific discovery, or the women's personal fight, did you find the most shocking? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this true story compelling, please hit the like button, subscribe for more historical narratives, and share this video to keep the memory of the women who glowed in the dark alive.